Thank you so much. That was an incredibly thorough and inspiring presentation. It was a ton of information. It was really convincing. And we don't often see that kind of specificity and how you're going to be using the funds and what you need the funds for. That is really helpful to us in just helping people who donate know this is going to work. This is effective. This is going to where it needs to go. So we really appreciate your putting all of that together and being with us tonight. We know you're very, very busy. But thank you for being here. We're going to do question and answer in a little while, just in a short while. I'm hoping that you can stay with us for a bit. So anybody with questions for Jonathan or Mandela, please put them in the chat and we'll be curating those in a second. But first, I'm going to hand this over to Mary Pence, the head of our fundraising team in 31st Street.
Hello, friends. I'm Mary Pence, and tonight I'd like to expand on a theme from a recent Heather Cox Richardson column. So, slightly more than 80 years ago, well into World War II, the Nazis launched a surprise attack against the Allies' front line. And 6 days into that battle, the Germans sent a demand to a U.S. general telling him that his forces in the town of Bastogne were encircled, and that the only possibility of saving his troops from total annihilation was surrender. General McAuliffe's famous retort was nuts. He never did surrender, and the Allies pushed back the bulge created by the Germans, moving the front line back to where it had been before the Nazi offensive. And so I believe this black line on this map, which represents the front established by the Allies, can be analogized to the state of our American democracy before the guy with the orange hair took office. And the bulge, which is depicted by the red line, can be analogized to the beating our democracy has taken in the last 10 days. And so during this historic battle of the bulge, Allied soldiers acting individually and in small groups defended important crossroads and slowed down the Germans in whatever way they could, and they held on until reinforcements could come. 19,000 U.S. troops died in this one battle, and thousands more were wounded. So these troops fighting to defend democracy and defeat fascism gave so much. Our challenge is to honor them by also saying nuts, by refusing to surrender, and by doing what we can to defeat the authoritarianism that is looming over us. For my husband, Dan, and me, that means being part of the leadership team of 31st Street. It means being co-hosts for tonight's event, and it means contributing $5,000 of our funds to help elect a progressive woman judge to the Supreme Court of Wisconsin. So here's my request of you. Would you keep in mind the image of these men pushing back the Germans in the winter of 1944, as well as the image of the Progress to the Polls volunteers going door to door in wintry Milwaukee and Green Bay and Racine? Would you think about them as you think about making a contribution, or maybe even another contribution? Will you please join us in saying nuts, in stretching to contribute what you can today knowing that, as Jim said, this election on April 1st is a significant opportunity to stand up to the truly awfulness of this time that we are living through. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mary. That was a wonderful story, and it is inspiring. We don't have to put our lives on the line, at least not yet. And lots of people have been donating, and Jim may be able to give us an update on where we are before long, but many, many people are contributing. Thank you so much for doing that. So now we are going to open this to questions. Adele and I are going to sort of look through and find the questions and pose them. Adele, I can start, and if you can be looking at the other questions, then you can jump in.
Okay.
Let's see, one question. How have you found ways to convince people who say that they never vote to vote? Your videos are wonderful, but what else do you do?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to just making it as personal as possible for people. I mean, outside of this work, even as a candidate, that was obviously one of the most frustrating conversations to have. A person says they don't vote, and it's like, well, you start to ask questions, why don't people vote? And one of the most common answers is like, oh, well, everybody's the same, or, nobody's in it for me. They're all in it for themselves. Everybody's corrupt. And it's like, okay, well, a lot of this is actually true. And there are so many instances where all of it has been true. And it's certainly jaded people's sense of political activity or political involvement. But with that being said, I always remind them, well, somebody is going to be in charge at the end of the day. Somebody is going to win this election. And just because the person you want to win gets in office doesn't mean all the right things going to happen right away. And just because the person you don't want to get in office makes it in office doesn't mean you don't hold that person accountable. And whether it's the person you support it or not, you should hold people accountable. Elections and campaigns and elections, that is only step one of the process of democracy. You have to involve yourself in all of it. And if you, for whatever reason, feel that voting doesn't impact you, or politics has nothing to do with you, I can guarantee you it has something to do with a person you love, a person you care about. So making that personal appeal, and I can't say that it always works, unfortunately, but it has been one of the most effective methods that I've used.
Thank you.
I have a question that actually came to the leadership, which we should address, but I thought maybe part of the polls could answer it, which is, given all that's going on with the leaders of Facebook, Instagram, all the greedy billionaires, why should we still use those platforms to communicate? That was a question addressed to the 31st Street leadership, but I'm curious how you feel about it, then we'll answer it separately.
Yeah. The tough part there, because we are, with each post, we're just giving up more and more information to folks who have aligned themselves with a fascist regime. But with that being said, almost every aspect of our daily lives is touched by these folks who cannot care about our lives and our livelihoods. And it is, unfortunately, also, these are the only ways that we can get any sort of information out there to people in a quick way, where everything requires rapid response or an instant transfer of information and knowledge, until there are more methods for us to be able to do that are controlled by people who think like us. Unfortunately, I don't know how that happens. These are billion-dollar operations, and these are folks who are only committed to making more and more money on our backs. It's just the vicious reality that we're in right now.
Thanks, Mandela. So I don't know, Jim, do you want to answer that in terms of 31st Street and our use of Facebook?
Oh, I think we're much better off using Facebook. We can reach a lot of people we want to reach. There are a lot of people still on Facebook, a lot of blue voters, a lot of purple voters. It doesn't really help to sort of, take your basketball and go home. Sorry, in my opinion.
Okay.
Over.
Thanks, Jim.
Okay, I've got one from Barbara Woodall. And it may be a sort of similar answer that you gave earlier about just getting people to vote, but are there specific examples of how organizers are able to convince potential voters that they are being fed misinformation or lies? How do you get people willing to listen and believe what you're telling them?
Well, the thing about it is we can't, we have the conversations and we try to have repeated conversations. I mentioned some folks we talked to 4 times. The reality is that regardless of who's presenting information to a person, they're going to have that option, whether they believe it or not. They're also going to address those conversations with their own personal bias. With that being the case, we have to be, again, as compelling as possible when we're talking to people. And we can't talk over people's heads. We can't just give our, we can't speak on an issue just based on our perspective. And, one thing certainly, everybody on this call, myself especially, the cause of democracy, it is important to me. It is important to all of us. It is important. It is the most important thing. But when we're showing up to some doors or most doors in our universe, like that's just a message that doesn't translate. It doesn't, it just doesn't matter, because when people are struggling to pay the bills, keep the lights on, when people have whatever issue under the sun, if we are promoting a system that just has not worked for them, not that any system, not that any other form of government is going to be better for them by any means, but if we are specifically defending a form of government that they have really never seen a single benefit from, it falls flat. And so it has to be as personal as possible. It has to be as individual as possible. And it has to be, as emotional as possible as well.
Great answer. Do you have one, Adele?
Yeah, so Meg asked, have you experienced right-wing intimidation? Trump is blaming everything on DEI, which is very threatening to, people of color. And so she wants to know if you've experienced that on the ground.
Yeah, so it hadn't necessarily happened on the ground. Two things to that point. We rarely see, the type of folks who may be antagonists from the right showing up in the communities that we're knocking on doors. I'll just put it that way. And another piece of that too, when we talk about DEI and Donald Trump attacking DEI, I've just raised a question to people that I talk to, especially in more casual conversation. It's like, all right, well, if you thought for whatever reason Donald Trump might be better for Black people, one, sorry, I just don't get it. But we live different lives. But I will also say that when Donald Trump or any of his allies talk about DEI, when they castigate diversity, equity, and inclusion, when they bastardize DEI as a concept, they're saying Black people. They are blaming Black people. Anything they blame on DEI, that is a way for them to blame Black people for something that Black people didn't have anything to do with. It's just like when they use the word woke, and now it's just DEI.
Mm-hmm. So I guess this is a sort of a related question. I mean, have you found that the voters you're talking to in these communities, like, are they reacting to things that this administration is doing? I mean, are they noticing some of the policies that maybe are going to hurt them? And are they talking about that?
So it's only been a week and we haven't had a chance to, be able to, have those conversations with people in the doors. Only thing, we can see is online chatter, which is all over the place. And people are, and I will say the online chatter though, I see people who hadn't necessarily been, super involved or political, like just post something like, oh, what's next? Or, just seeming to be more aware than they had been previously.
Okay. This is a question. Do you plan to talk about Act 10 and collective bargaining in your canvassing? Is that an issue that animates people?
So I can say it. I mean, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, but so Act 10, while, super important, it was still at the same time, very divisive here. And you see some of our biggest supporters being public sector unions. And so we talk about it on more of a conceptual basis, as in, people should be able to have dignity in the workplace. People should be able to freely and fairly join a union. I think that is the way to address it rather than get into the specifics of legislation.
Yeah, and I would also add Act 10 is very important. But I think what is resonating most with people at this moment about the Supreme Court race is the Affordable Care Act, and the fact that Republicans are trying to overturn it. And Brad Schimmel, when he was Attorney General, joined in a lawsuit to sue to do away with the Affordable Care Act. And so, yeah, that is really popping out in like all of the testing and messaging testing that is happening in the state right now.
Adele, did you see any other questions?
Not that I knew how to translate into a question. I think I'm wondering if anyone wants to raise their hand with a question. I think people have been having reactions about 2024 and the lack of voting and the apathy and not listening to the news, but I couldn't really put it into a question for them.
I think there were a couple of questions about whether direct mail really works.
Oh, I
that
missed
saw
that one.
earlier.
Okay.
Oh, okay, good
I
question.
can take that one. So maybe for someone that like lives in the suburbs that gets like 10,000 mail pieces a cycle, it doesn't have as much of effect. But the folks that we are talking to and that we are going out and finding are folks that are not traditionally targeted by campaigns or other organizations that have come in. And so for a lot of these folks, this is the first time they've received a mailer in the mail, and it has an impact.
Yeah, and there was also there was a pretty decent disparity too between mail that went out from Trump aligned entities versus ours.
I want to say that in this kind of election, which is, ultimately a somewhat low turnout election, and people don't tend to follow it that much, those are exactly the kind of elections where everything tends to work a lot better. Because, a piece of mail shows up and it's something unique. It's not like they get even in anywhere. So I mean, this is all the more reason to be weighing in this kind of election. Over.
Yeah.
So I think we're just going to take one or two more questions, and then we're going to wind up our formal program. And some of us will stay on for other questions. But just one more. Did you run into misinformation among the folks that you talked to? In Pennsylvania, this member ran into repeating myths that illegal immigrants are being put up in 4-star hotels, they're being given credit card, just crazy myths that this person was hearing when she was canvassing in Pennsylvania. Do you hear sort of repeated myths from voters?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons why we, talk about the need for us to be out there as early as possible, as often as possible. If there are specifics you want to talk about, Jonathan, please feel free.
Oh no, I 100% agree. Like it is just important for us to be out on the doors talking to people as much as possible so we can combat these myths before they really start to like take hold and penetrate into the community.
Okay, well, I think we're going to wind up. It's 8:01 with the formal part of the program. Some of us will stick around if other people want to continue to chat or have questions, but we really appreciate everybody attending. I saw, Jim, I think you said we were up to 104,000.
130 now, and I think it must have been Mary, this inspirational message that sort of gave us a nice, kick up.
Okay, so we're at 130. Our goal is 200. So we will get there. We always get there. But we really appreciate everybody who contributed tonight. It's wonderful. Thank you very, very much. So if you want to say goodnight, we will say goodnight. If you want to stick around, some of us will stick around. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you all. Really,
Thank you.
really appreciate everything.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
I had a question. Was that amount that was raised, what was raised tonight, or is that cumulative?
That's cumulative. We started off at about 81 tonight. So we raised over $50,000 tonight.
Wow. Okay. Highly, highly impressive.
That's good to
So that-
know.
you helped.
Well, by pennies.
Whatever.
Every penny
Everything
helps.
Everything counts. Yep. Yeah, any other comments? You can sort of raise your hand. We'll look around and see if we see you. Comments or questions?
Yeah, people can.
You had your hand up a minute ago.
Angela?
Bill Chandler has a
Oh,
question.
Bill, and then Angela.
And I have a question too.
Okay, and then Catherine.
Okay, hello, this is Bill Chandler. I just read a terrific podcast today by Tom Hartman about the messaging problems that the Democrats around the country have. And it's great that these people are on the doors. I would like to hear the kinds of messages they're going to be trying to use and the stories they tell. You know, Hartman emphasizes that people react emotionally to stories, and I agree with him 100%. This stuff about bringing up Nazi fascism and stuff, I don't think sells. And I think we ought to go to the heart of the problem and really attack it straight on in a way that people are going to emotionally react to it. So I would love to communicate with Barnes to find out how, what kind of messages do they take? It's nice to say you are a citizen and you should turn out to vote. Whoopee, okay. But what do you vote? Why would you? What are you going to vote for? They need some meat to know that their vote is going to help get something or do something like save the Affordable Care Act that they may be getting health insurance under.
Do you want me to jump in real quick on that? Just I'm Kory. I work with Mandela and the Power of the Polls team, and happy to
Yeah, Kory.
really quickly. So I think that's a really, really great question, Bill. And I think there's a couple pieces to that. But we spent a lot of time last year doing focus groups in the community, doing research polling in the community. And there were two things that worked extremely well. The first was the idea of the collective power that votes can have. And you heard Mandela talk about this, that, it's very disempowering when people think, oh, I'm one person, I can't make any change. But when you actually talk about the collective power that a community has, it resonates in a real way, especially if you have real people telling that story and talking about the ways in which it impacts them. The second piece that was very, very powerful, and I don't think this is necessarily true in every, demographic and group and community, but the historical context of the sort of generational duty that people have, and talking about the sacrifices that were made by so many before to provide the right to vote, the marching and the suffering that so many people went through, we have an obligation to live up to that, and it means something. And that you saw that in a couple of the ads that we aired, it meant a lot. And we had organizers coming in and talking about, hey, I saw this ad, that's why I'm here. My grandfather, the person who you saw say, his grandfather couldn't read or write, but always voted. That was one of our organizers. He was literally somebody who had never organized before, but came in because he saw the work we were doing and said, sign me up, tell me what to do. And became one of our leads and recruited, countless other organizers. So those were two of the biggest pieces just in terms of mobilizing what encouraged people to vote.
Thank you.
So Angela, and then somebody else had a question. Oh, Catherine. So Angela.
Oh, hi, and thank you for running this great program. I was curious to know, maybe one of our experts knows, to what degree in these next several weeks they may be able to actually register new voters still, people who haven't participated in the past, because it sounds as though you're going to communities where it's low propensity voters, or perhaps I heard the phrase something to the effect of people who would never vote.
So Kory, can you answer that?
Yeah, absolutely. So Wisconsin, we are very lucky in Wisconsin in that we are a same-day voter registration state. And so there are certainly going to be registration efforts out there. What we have found is that rather than trying to get people to sort of do a two-step process of like get registered, send it in, which can be fraught, and there's a lot of people who move around and are in new places. What we have tended to focus on is let's go have the conversation. Let's remind them that they can vote on election day and they can register right there at the polls. And we give them materials that say, hey, to do that, just remember to bring, a bill that has your address on it and an ID. While also talking about the importance of voting, because then we're just asking them to do one thing, which is go to the polls on election day. Now, that's not true in every state, right? There are a lot of places where we don't have same-day registration, unfortunately, and there are incredible groups out there who do a lot of great work to get folks registered, to find those people, and make sure that they get activated.
Thank you. That's helpful to know. Catherine and then Ruth. And if you're not muted, please mute.
Hi. So I had a related question also about registering voters. So there have been a lot of really effective efforts to reach out to high schools for people who are young and just becoming eligible to vote. And I wondered if there are any things that letter writing groups, or maybe even us, could do to reach out to them, or what ideas do you have about that? Thanks.
And I think that's to you, Kory.
So I know there definitely are groups that do work in that space. And I do think that that is a place that we may very well expand out into. What we've tried to do is be very focused about our targets, because there is a lot of, mission creep that happens with organizations where they try to do a lot of things and don't do any very well. And so we've stayed very laser focused on these targeted folks. However, I think there's a couple things that we want to do in 2025, and that is very interesting. I think it's an interesting angle. I think there's two places we want to expand into. One is a lot more work in the faith community, working with pastors to really get into churches and do more organizing in that space and get them involved in that process as well. I do think the high school piece, though, is very, very interesting, especially given access that we have to, a lot of local artists and influencers who, may have a lot more resonance with, high school students and college students who are just getting on campus for the first time. So I'm glad you brought that up. It is absolutely something that we are looking at. If we do, we want to make sure we do it for real and in a very deliberate way. But, I absolutely agree. If we can get folks started early on, and frankly, find people who want to organize, right? It's a great, job to go out and do this. If they're looking for a way to get involved, that's another great way to get people involved early.
And Ruth?
Hey, so this is also for Kory, and I know you want to be very focused and win on April 1st, and we all do too. I'm curious, in the run up to that, though, will you be trying to talk to people at all about what is going on in DC now? I mean, around some of the confirmations, around Kennedy and measles and whatever, and get some sense of that, and we'll
Absolutely. And it's
play.
something we do with our organizers in terms of how we train them, which is you're going to have a conversation. Obviously, we very much want them to talk about upcoming elections and what's important, and there's certain pieces of information. But ultimately, what we want them to do is be listeners and build that trust and find out what people are concerned about. We did a lot of this in 2023 and 2024. And I know Mandela mentioned this, but we didn't even make our first vote ask until I think it was August of 2024. What we were doing before then is we were actually talking about resources that were available. We were talking about internet access that was available because of the Infrastructure Act. We were talking about ways that people could save money on their utility bills. We were talking about different resources, and obviously tying it back to work that Democratic officials were doing. But that opened a lot of doors for us and really broke down barriers. And we were able to have long sustained conversations with folks and get people more engaged, because we weren't talking to them about Kamala Harris or Donald Trump or any of that, where people put their blinders up. So that's sort of a long way of saying, yes, we want to continue to do that. And then once we get past April 1st, we want to continue that work to have those conversations about resources that are available and how people can get engaged and ways that they can get involved in their community, even beyond sort of the political asks that we're going to be making of them.
Perfect. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's a great question, and happy to share out on an ongoing basis too, the kinds of things that we're hearing. Cause I'll tell you, so many of the things that percolated up at the national level, we were hearing at the doors very early in 2024. And saw a lot of the problems coming, unfortunately.
Anybody else before we close out? I don't see anybody.
No.
Okay, so thanks again for coming, and have a good night. And thank you all for donating. Wonderful.
143,000.
All right,
Yay.
143. Woo!
Hello?